Well, good afternoon and welcome to Funding Futures. Today's program is brought to you by Miles Partnership and Civitas. We have a terrific program with some very special guests lined up for you today. The content is a deep dive into two subjects we addressed in our Funding Futures study released just 2 months ago. We will be talking about dedicated funding and we'll be talking about sales tax increment financing today. But let me do some brief introductions, if I could, first of our presenters. Chris Adams is head of research and insights for Miles Partnership. He has worldwide experience in tourism. In fact, he's joining us today from New Zealand. He specializes in new technology and new media. He's passionate about sustainability issues and is the co-founder and board member of the Travel Care Code, a not-for-profit focused on educating visitors to travel responsibly. Welcome, Chris. Laura Libby, Senior Vice President with Miles Partnership. She has broad experience in destination marketing and in heritage tourism. She's part of the leadership team over at Miles, and I know many of you, whether you're in a state travel office or local DMO, have worked with Laura and her team over the years. We're very fortunate to be joined by such a terrific set of panelists today. Each of these individuals is a national leader in the DMO space, and they each have unique accomplishments when it comes to funding for their DMOs. I'll have more formal introductions later in the program, but I want to say thank you to Julie Coker, President and CEO of San Diego Tourism Authority, Kevin Kane, President and CEO of Memphis Tourism, and David Williams, Associate Managing Director of the Utah Office of Tourism, for joining us today. All right, our program. We're going to start with a brief overview of the Funding Futures study. Chris is going to detail not only the study, but where you can get copies of that study. We're then going to turn to dedicated funding. We're going to talk about dedicated funding mechanisms and tourism improvement districts in particular. We'll then have that TID panel discussion with Julie and with Kevin, talking about how they were able to start those mechanisms, what some of their challenges were, what some of their successes were, and how they were the first in their respective states to do that. We'll then shift gears and talk about another very exciting but less often used mechanism of sales tax increment financing, a little bit about the history and how it works. And then Laura will interview Dave, telling us more specifically what Utah has done and the tremendous success story around their financing for tax increment financing. And finally, we'll open it up to Q&A at the end. Please feel free to send in your questions through the question box. We're happy to answer those in part, maybe through the panels as we go along, but certainly at the end of the presentation as well. Chris?
Thanks so much, John, and great to be with everybody. Yeah, this was a tremendously exciting project in a time of real crisis. So it was fabulous to come together with John, the whole team at Civitas, Adam and the whole team at Tourism Economics, and some invaluable support from Aaron and the team of destination analysts around the research. And we had great support from US Travel Association, Destination Council, DMAC in Canada, and a shout out to Kathleen and the team there, and Destinations International. And so what we attempted to do was to look in this moment at the opportunities around funding and the future of funding specifically for DMOs. And if we have a look at the next slide, we'll see these various sort of component parts that we looked at. And that spanned everything from reviewing the current situation, running focus groups with key DMO leaders across North America. We looked at past crises to glean lessons. We did a survey with destination analysts of 115 North American DMOs. Tourism Economics did some great work. There's a whole section there on the recovery. We looked at and identified and outlined 10 new or enhanced funding options. And in fact, today we're looking at a couple of those under the dedicated sort of funding umbrella, and recommendations for actions. We've been running follow-up webinars. You can tap into those, and then we'll be talking about the European study, and in fact, a big transatlantic webinar that we've got coming up. Just a quick look at those 10 new or enhanced funding options. They cover the full gambit. We had, on an earlier webinar, we actually looked at short-term rental revenue and reserves, we're actually looking at running additional webinars in the future. So you can see there's a whole sort of menu of options, and there's some critical areas, both short-term around recovery funding and stimulus spending, as well as some of these ideas for sort of medium to longer term changes. The resources, the report, etc., are all available online. You can access them there, both on the Miles Partnership website or Civitas's website. You can access the full report, which is well over 100 pages, or you can download the section reports. And then we briefly mentioned the European report. We actually worked with Group Now and the Global Destination Sustainability Movement on a major report that they conducted into Europe, all 30 European countries. They looked at actually at 67 European cities, and there's some tremendous insights about some of the innovative areas that Europe is undertaking. And so we've distilled this all into a combined webinar, which we're running next week. And so that webinar, called Funding for Tomorrow, is going to be bringing together the key critical authors from Miles, Civitas, Group Now, and the sustainability movement. And we're going to be having a panel of 4 city leaders from across North America and Europe. So Anaheim, New York, Stockholm, and Hamburg are all going to join us to talk about the implications and the priorities. And so exciting webinar. Please sign up for that. That's available on either of those 2 websites, and plus we'll be sharing the link. Thanks a lot, John. I'll come back at the questions and answers. Look forward to a great discussion today.
Thank you so much, Chris. And there is so much happening with this, just really exciting and really terrific to do that transatlantic webinar. I think it's going to be a great presentation, and we've got a lot that we can share and a lot we can learn from each other. Let's dive right into dedicated funding. Over the last 20 years, our firm has worked with a great number of DMOs really across the globe on funding challenges. And dedicated funding means different things to different folks. And unfortunately, so many times we've dealt with bureaus and state travel offices that really believed that their funding was indeed dedicated, only to find out in a tough time that it wasn't as dedicated as they thought. And we have seen an erosion of funding, whether it's through the bed tax mechanism, which is by far the most common. We're going to be talking about that in a minute. The dedication level of that, of course, varies from state to state and jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but we certainly have seen an erosion. So I thought, let's talk about what we mean when we talk about dedication. First, as a lawyer, I like thinking about legal dedication. What are our legal rights around the dedication of the monies? And that can come from either a grant in the legislature. I know many of you have mechanisms out there that talk about the money being dedicated for certain purposes. And of course, the advent of the special benefit assessment mechanism that exists in all 50 states around the US, as well as in Canada and the UK. This is, by its very legal nature, a dedicated fund that cannot be diverted. That's one reason we have seen use of the tourism improvement district model, is that it takes advantage of this special benefit assessment idea, and that it's legally dedicated and can't be diverted by our local or state leaders. The other kind of dedication that we've seen more of over the years is political dedication. And I know many of you rely on political dedication in many of your respective jurisdictions, right? It is the good graces of the legislature, in some cases, maybe of the city council, to give you money. But as we think about mechanisms for financing, I think it's critically important to think about how can we create mechanisms in which our leaders see the funds as our funds as opposed to government funds. And when the industry is involved in setting up, designing, voting on, and managing a mechanism, all of a sudden the political dedication dynamic changes. And we've seen lots of examples where elected leaders will refer to those kinds of funds and those kinds of monies as the industry's money, as opposed to government money. And that's something really to think about as you all are thinking about new dedicated funding sources. Think about ways that you can set yourself up to increase that political dedication factor in addition to the legal dedication. So bed taxes, I know so many of you have this as a source of funding, and certainly there has been a movement within our industry to diversify funding. COVID has been devastating to our industry, to our partners, and folks are looking for other sources of funding. Yet still, bed tax is one of those areas that we tend to be highly reliant on. We, as part of the study that we just released, we updated a look at all of the lodging tax revenues across 100 destinations, and that average now is almost 15% in terms of the lodging taxes. But the amount of that money that ends up coming back to Dmos really is quite small. Over 50% of the money that we studied was dedicated for general fund purposes. That is, went straight to the general fund. And then within the rest of the money, of course, some of it went to tourism promotion. Many of those dollars went to arts and cultural and other tourism activities, sports activities, a whole host of other monies and other sources beyond just tourism promotion kinds of efforts. And really, I think that experience with bed tax, both as a less stable mechanism and also a declining mechanism in many places, led to the advent of tourism improvement districts. And as I mentioned, this is based on that assessment model. That is, it is a special benefit assessment. It must be spent to benefit the payers. And that's a key aspect of this from a legal dedication standpoint. It's collected by the local government and ultimately managed by the DMOs in conjunction with the hotel industry. And I put a quote on here from Susie Santo from Wichita. Boy, she's done a great job. Her special district dedicated funding that she was able to create actually doubled her budget in that case and has been really a major source of additional revenue for the Bureau to be able to market the destination. There are now 181 of these districts around the country in 17 states. About half of them levy their assessment based on gross revenue, 1%, 2%, like that. Another half or so, just under half, levy it based on a fixed rate per occupied room per night. We had a district just recently formed here in California. Mobile, Alabama recently created the very first district in Alabama. Shout out to David Clark for his good work there. I know in Florida, Tampa has re-upped their tourism improvement district as of October 15th to start January 1 of next year. So congratulations on Tampa on moving forward on that. And we see a wide variety of these districts, from small communities, rural communities, to large urban centers. The largest here, the $41 million, that was a pre-COVID number for San Diego, what they were projected to raise for this year. We are now spread, really diversified across the country. And while these districts started in the West, they are by no means limited to the West. We see the districts throughout the West and the Midwest. Texas now has 4 districts there. Of course, the Texas Hotel and Lodging Association has done a good job on pushing sort of acceptance of these districts in Texas, and that's going well. Shout out to Ray Hoyt in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who just got his district approved after a challenge, and he is up and running in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the first district in Oklahoma. And you can see the rest. There are a couple of districts in Louisiana. I mentioned Florida. We're talking to Kevin from Memphis today. Pennsylvania has been a key state as well. And obviously Julie, with her background in Philadelphia, can fill us in on some of that. You can see here all the states that are in line to be pursuing TIDs in the coming months. Many of these states are pursuing legislation. Others are just simply setting up districts under existing law. But I expect that we will see at least 5 of these states turn blue within the next 2 years. So a lot of folks ask, what is the evolution of dedicated funding? Where are we going to see changes in this? What kinds of changes are out there on the horizon? Well, first is the shift, of course, from taxes to assessments. We've seen that happening. That is very healthy for our industry and has proved to be really a blessing, both as it relates to legal and political dedication. We're starting to see more and more of the involvement of restaurants. In 2010s, we saw the emergence of culinary districts, and we're seeing more of that. We're also seeing activities amongst attractions, car rental, and retail in some districts. We're currently working on the very first wine marketing district, and we expect to have that done in the next several months. And the first cannabis improvement district, if you can imagine that, in California, only in California, right? But we expect that to be coming forward. The other thing that we are seeing is a focus on recovery. No surprises since COVID. This idea of tourism recovery districts has really been pursued. In New York, the legislation that many of the Dmos there have done a fantastic job. Kristen Jarnigan in Long Island, Patrick Kaler in Buffalo, and so many others around the state of New York to get legislation introduced that is tourism recovery and improvement district legislation. And really that allows for the TID mechanism. It allows for scalability. It allows you to build reserves. The assessments can start at any date that you can agree on with the hotels, and they can be gradually increased over time if that's how you and the hotels choose to do it. And of course, as always, the formation costs are reimbursable from district revenues. So that is sort of where we're at on the dedicated funding front and tourism improvement districts and some of the changes that we're seeing. And right now, maybe Lauren can help me. We would like to do a couple of polls with all of you. We have a couple of questions on the polls. And the first question here is, are you looking for a new funding mechanism? And if you wouldn't mind, just answer what your answer is on this. The screen should pop up. And if you would answer what you're looking for in terms of a new funding mechanism, and we can show you some of the results from that discussion, from that question, excuse me. We're going to get your feedback on two of these questions. This is the first. And Lauren, can we put those results up? Fantastic. So really a mixed bag. By far the largest response here was yes, sometime in the next year. So 42%, almost half of you on the line are looking at doing something in the next year. Actually, if you add up in the 3 to 6 months and the other, you actually get over almost 75%, 3/4 of you sometime in the next year, with a fifth of you saying now would be great, 10% in the next 3 to 6 months, and then a quarter, a little over, saying no, not at this time. So thank you for taking that poll. That's great to see. And really this is consistent with what we've seen in other jurisdictions and other destinations as well, which is an awful lot of folks that are looking to take an opportunity of this very difficult challenge that we've had to reshape their funding mechanisms, to create something that's going to be more sustainable for them on an economic basis, essentially building back better what they've had compared to what they've had in the past. Okay, our next question. When developing a new dedicated funding stream, the question is, there are many measures that can be employed to protect your existing funding. And please check all those that you're familiar with or have employed. That is a baseline written agreement. That is some agreement that says your existing funding will be protected. Poison pill. What does this mean? This is simply something that is inserted in your funding mechanisms that allow you to cancel them if your underlying funding is ever reduced. We've had that happen. We've had that approach taken in many of our jurisdictions and been very effective. Many folks rely on oral agreement. Others rely on essentially political support for their underlying funding. So if you wouldn't mind voting on these items, and we'll put the results up on the screen as well. Okay, Lauren, do we have some results from this poll? Okay, fantastic. Boy, look at that. The highest number one vote getter there was baseline written agreement at 72%. So that's great news because those written statements are so much stronger than any sort of oral representation. Still 20% at oral, 64% relying on political support. And that's not surprising to me a bit. I'll tell you, we see that over and over again. And while that's helpful and it's good, we also see some significant challenges around that as well. Thank you all for participating in our poll questions and to be a part of that. Let's shift gears now and let's open it up for our panel discussion. And let me first start by introducing our panelists today. Boy, are we fortunate today. I feel like we really lucked out with the speakers that agreed to join us. First, let me introduce Julie Coker as President and CEO of San Diego Tourism Authority. She previously served as President and CEO of the Philadelphia Convention and Visitors Bureau. She's got experience both on the East Coast and West Coast with very large bureaus. And prior to joining the Philadelphia CVB, she was the general manager for the Hyatt Regency Philadelphia, where she oversaw a 350-room hotel. She's a board member not only of U.S. Travel, but also Destinations International. And get this, she's been in California about 8 months, and listen to the boards that she's on. California Travel Association, Visit California, San Diego Regional Chamber of Commerce, San Diego Regional Economic Development Corporation, and the Downtown San Diego Partnership. Julie, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, John. Good to be here.
And let me introduce Mr. Kevin Kane as President and CEO of Memphis Tourism, a position that he's held for almost 3 decades. He serves on the board of U.S. Travel and is the past chair of the board of Destinations International. Kevin's a tennis enthusiast and is immediate past executive committee member of the Tennis Hall of Fame in Newport, Rhode Island. Kevin is also a real estate investor in downtown Memphis, where he owns restaurants and entertainment venues on Beale Street. Some have called him Mr. Memphis. It's worth noting that in 2 weeks, on November 15th, that day is officially the Kevin Kane Day, as proclaimed by the Memphis City Council. Kevin, we're so lucky to have you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, John.
Let's turn right into the questions. And Julie, if I could ask you first, in 2016, 2017, I know in Philadelphia, you were looking for supplemental funding. Tell us the story of what led to the very first tourism improvement district in Pennsylvania.
Sure. So we were fortunate. We had hosted, or Philadelphia had hosted at the time, the NFL draft, which everyone knows comes with, somewhat of a price tag. And in addition to that, the city of Philadelphia is fortunate to host the Army-Navy game every December. And that too has a financial ask. And so literally the director of commerce for the city of Philadelphia called me one morning and said, Julie, we have to do something different. Philadelphia has a very tight budget, as most cities do. And so looking for dedicated funding for these large sporting events is something that we need to look into. The good news is that we expanded that conversation, included our hotel community immediately, and said, yes, there's definitely a need for sporting events, but there's also a need for large conventions. We needed to level the playing field. And there were often times that we were looking for incentives to attract large conventions. And that at that time was coming out of the operating budget for Philadelphia, which wasn't a sustainable model. And I know, Kevin can relate to that. And there are so many other, things that need to be done by a bureau. So fortunately, the 3-legged stool kicked in between the convention center, the Convention and Visitors Bureau, or DMO, and the hotel community. And with John's assistance, we were able to successfully implement a TID, which they refer to as the FIL. And I'm proud to say that was voted on in 17, and they started collecting in 2018, and things are going extremely well. So the need for sporting events started it, but the good thing is the conversation turned to other needs. But it all really started from a budget and being able to have a funding mechanism that the hotel community, which is extremely important, can vote on and say yes or no to, which I think is key.
And Julie, in your case, it really was dedicated for that specific purpose of raising money for those events, not in a broad general marketing way or others. It really was very specific.
Right. In the city of Philadelphia, it was specifically a bid fund with criteria attached to it, obviously a return on investment. All contracts or all applications are submitted to the committee and they're voted on. And those funding and then that funding takes place. But yes, theirs is a bid fund.
Yeah. And Kevin, your situation was a bit different. You actually were lined up potentially to lose some funding because of the way the FedEx Forum was funded. Isn't that right? What led you to create the first TID in Tennessee?
Our primary funding, John, was a county bed tax and a portion of the county bed tax. And a city bed tax was created initially a few years earlier before the FedEx Forum to handle some cost overruns of our convention center, the last convention center renovation, not the $200 million renovation we're going through currently. And what our industry did, we said, well, if we're going to raise the bed tax, and it was very slight, like created a city bed tax, which was like 1.5%. I said, why don't we add some money in there for promoting the city? And so we got a portion of that. And at that time, they asked us, we'll give you X amount of dollars permanently, or you can take all the surplus after the bond debt is paid, but it's only going to last you for 12 years. And I said, 12 hours, that would have. So I said, well, we'll take everything for 12 years. Number one, I figured, we'll have a whole new set of government leaders 12 years from now. Hopefully I'll still be around and I'll be the only person that will know the history, which in fact became true. So we let it expire. And so all that we were about to lose, all the city bed tax funding to the now construction of the FedEx Forum for our NBA team. So we needed to do something to replace that funding. And of course, I was watching what was going on with TIDs in the West Coast primarily. There wasn't very few in the east of the Mississippi River. And I went to knew John from serving on some boards. And I said, look, I think let's see if we can figure this out in the state of Tennessee. Let's see if we can figure this out in Tennessee. And we found a tourism improvement district, a business improvement district. And we said, and John did some research being an attorney. He said, you know what? I think we can use a hybrid of something you got in the existing state of Tennessee. This was so controversial that the Tennessee hotel lobbyist out of Nashville called to me. He said, I'm not going to say anything to anybody, but this is unconstitutional. So I said, oh God, this isn't going to last 6 months. And I had the whole industry, our whole industry lobbyist telling us that what we were doing was illegal. And John assured me, he said, no, it's not. And he said, in fact, why don't you take it to the state attorney general yourself? And we did, and the state attorney general said it was legal. And I still think to this point we're the only destination in the state of Tennessee that has this mechanism. Well, what would have happened for us? Our budget at the time was $12 million. It was going to be reduced to $9 million, and as a result of that, it is $15 million. So we would have lost 25%, and we gained 25%. So in essence, we went from 12 million to 15 million, but we would have gone to 9 million. It was basically a 50% swing, so it was big. It was a big deal for us. And let me also say, we did it a little bit differently. I think most TIDs are percentages because we're dominated by limited service hotels. Our average daily rate is less than $100. It was like $92. I said, well, let's take $2 a night instead of 2%. So obviously through the pandemic, that's worked in our favor as room rates have dropped dramatically. So we're still getting $2 a night, even though we have fewer nights, we still get the $2 a night versus 2%, which we would have gotten hit twice. So it's worked out really well for us.
And Kevin, let's talk about sort of where we're at now with COVID-19. The pandemic has really exposed the vulnerabilities of our industry and of DMOs. It's also highlighted the vital role our DMOs play in the local economies and in our communities. And Julie, I wanted to ask you, from your vantage point, what opportunities can DMOs harness, and how could this translate into opportunities for future funding, given the terrible crisis that we're in today?
Sure. So when I first started in Philadelphia and started working in DMOs, I remember having conversations like this with Kevin and others from the beginning. And the first thing I'm going to say is, you can't wait for a crisis to have your first conversation with your elected officials. So that's the first thing that I would say to any DMO, is that you should have a ongoing dialogue and relationship with elected officials year-round, 365, so that when crises like this come up, they already know who you are and they accept your call. So that's the first thing I would say. Kevin's right. I mean, we're one of those cities that is a percentage, of hotel rates, and obviously here in San Diego, that has proven to be very successful. I wasn't here, but as I look back, and I'll say in 2008, I want to say the city of San Diego funding to SDTA was about 8.8 million. And as you pointed to, last year, and I'll go with, fiscal 19 numbers, because they're much more positive than where we are right now. But the funding to TMD was 36 million. So it definitely was right. And obviously there's also been an increase in supply as well that has helped that too. In a contrast to a city like Philadelphia that has dedicated legislated tax funding in addition to TID funding. So they were fortunate and very successful in keeping the portion of the bed tax that is dedicated to the DMO there, Visit Philadelphia, who's the strong marketing arm for Philadelphia in terms of North America. And then the well-executed convention center, just in case my Philadelphia friends are on. So the three of them split the hotel tax. And when we pursued the TID, it was important for us to make sure that that funding would stay intact and that this would be additional and not replace of. So I think that's important for folks also to make sure that this shouldn't be a replacement, that hopefully if you're able to maneuver, that it should be in addition to, so that you're able to do all the appropriate funding.
And I think we've got time for one more question, maybe for each of you. And Kevin, let me ask you about the hotels. How did you engage with your hoteliers, and have you seen a difference in terms of, did it impact the relationship with the hotels, creating the TID? Did that change things with the hotels in any form? In fact, we had one person already write a question in, how could hotels be in favor of something like this at a time when they are really looking at survival?
Well, John, as you're very aware, and to get a tourism improvement district, which it was called a business improvement district in the state of Tennessee, even though we call it a TID, you had to have the industry support. And so we had to basically have the majority of our rooms sign up to support this. And we went to the Hotel Lodging Association and got their leadership, which had most of the larger hotels were members. And we got them on board, and then we went at the work of getting the smaller limited service properties. We got almost 200 hotels in Shelby County. So we went to work on getting the support. So we had to have the support. The way we sold it was twofold. Number one, we said we were going to do additional marketing, but I saw a mechanism that Butch had done when they built the Music City Center in Nashville, and they created a event fund over a special assessment that they did. I think it was over of alcohol sales of all things, or parking lots. Might have been a combination of both. But regardless, Butch created an event fund that helped them with their New Year's Eve and other things that they do that are so successful in Nashville. And that was one of the big selling points, that we were now going to create an event fund that would help, that would benefit everybody. Large hotels, small hotels, help us bring events. Not only helps pay support to get conventions here, but also events. And that was, I think, Sean, was one of the big selling points. And let me just say that do not give up your bed tax. And, so don't do I totally agree with Julie. You don't want to give up one form of funding for just to replace it with another form of funding, because somebody's going to take that money and do something else with it. You need to go on and try to keep that into promoting the destination, in my opinion. So it's worked out great for us. One other thing, John, that has worked out for us is that our county bed tax, we receive a dollar amount that was set in law some 35 years ago, and it grows by 5% a year. There's been years where we said, man, we wish we could change it where we just had a 2.5 or 2.25% of the bed tax, because we would have made a lot more than 5%. But once again, because of what's going on right now, the downturns at this point has not impacted us. So we're still receiving the same county bed tax that we're supposed to receive by state law, and it's a dollar amount. So we haven't been impacted, even though our bed tax, I'm sure, is down. I don't know how far it's down. I don't want to know. You don't want to compare. But the reality of it is we're still getting the check. So whereas a lot of destinations have taken a really large hit, we've taken a very minimal hit, and that's on the TID side, where the $2 per night, we're not selling as many $2 per nights that we were before this, but the majority of our funding, the county bed tax, is still right at $12 million or whatever the number is it's supposed to be at this point in time. And we're very fortunate for that. And we're probably one of the few places that have a dollar amount funding versus a percent of the bed tax.
Got it.
The thing that I would add to with Kevin's point is, for those that are, unsure about, the thing about hoteliers is they have control of this. And I think that's important because they vote on the applications, they approve the applications, and they are part of the process. Oftentimes in destinations, you are leaving your success up to others. And many on this call, and you certainly know, John, and prior to me coming to San Diego, the challenge that they had with elected officials here, which was completely unfair. And it had nothing to do with the performance of SDTA or anyone who was here at the time, but it was just one of those things. And so, having the ability to have the control over what is funded from that TID is extremely important. And I know that that's a big selling point, and was a big selling point here for the TMD. And it was also a selling point for Philadelphia. I mean, those applications are submitted to a subcommittee, and they're approved, and then they're kicked up to the full committee to vote on. The thing that I would say to the question of, why would hotels look at it right now? I have to be honest with you, that slight 1% or 2% or 0.75, it is probably not going to deter your demand. Now, everyone knows that in their own destination, because depending on where they are with tax and the assessment on top of it, it might make them non-competitive. But think of it holistically, and what that's 0.75% or 1% or whatever you come up with, or the flat dollar amount, dollar room, just make sure that, it's not pricing you out. But to say that it's going to halt your demand, it probably is not going to do that.
Well, boy, I could go ahead, Kim.
Before because I know we're about to go to Chris's section, and it's very important, so I don't want to take any time away from that. But I do want to point out three things that I think everybody needs to be thinking about. 2021, we could have a record number of foreclosures in the hotel industry. It's just a fact. A lot of people who are suffering right now are starting to get the rug pulled out from under them from their lenders. It's happening here, it's happening all over the country. And we should be very concerned about that, because a lot of those people are already in the rears of their bed tax payments. So that's one thing that everybody needs to be very concerned about. The other thing is that I know it happened in North Carolina at one point. I don't know if they've restored it since then, but be careful of hoteliers and hotel districts that are going to their governments and saying, we want to collect the bed tax, or we want to collect the TI, but we want the money to come to us. Now, I know in some jurisdictions that's illegal to use the money for any reason other than it's for, but you've got some governments that are under a lot of pressure to give support to members of the hospitality industry that are really suffering. And one of the things that people are looking at is collecting taxes, but having that taxes go straight to the hotel for operations versus being remitted to their local destination marketing organization. So please, we got to be steadfast to not support anything like that at any cost, because it will ultimately be the downfall and the doom of destination marketing.
Thank you, Kevin. And thank you, Julia. We could talk all afternoon. You have so many great things to share. We're getting a lot of really good questions. If you all would stick around for our Q&A at the end, I know people would really appreciate it. Folks are asking about a lot about sort of control. How do your partners interface? How do they participate in decision-making? Those kinds of questions. And we'll get to those at the end of the session. Thank you both very much for your insights on what you've been able to do. Just to tee up our discussion around tax increment financing, many of you have heard of this topic before. I will be honest with you, I've been asked more about this mechanism in the last 3 months than I have in the last 10 years. There's tremendous interest. It is a way of diversifying your funding sources without raising anybody's taxes. So property tax increment first started in California way back in 1952. The idea was you drew a circle around an area. As property tax increased, that increment was invested back into the area. That concept was taken and moved into a different paradigm, one of sales tax increment financing. And you're going to hear much more about this in just a minute with Laura and Dave. Sales tax increment funding is a value capture mechanism. It typically identifies businesses that are in the tourism space, either by SIC or NAICS codes. Those businesses, as their sales tax increases, as you're able to promote tourism and increase the sales tax in that area, some portion of that increase goes back into tourism promotion. There are no new levies. It is simply diverting the growth of future sales tax dollars. Some of the advantages of this, you have a very large diversification of payers. It's not just hotels, right? It's all tourism businesses that are paying sales tax. There's a strong linkage between the growth and DMO funding, and it's politically palatable because you're not raising taxes. Some of the challenges associated with this mechanism, you'll likely need state legislation to put it in place. And during a crisis, your funding obviously may drop if you're talking about getting funding off of that increment. There are 3 state travel offices that have used this. Missouri did it based on, and they were the original based on 17 SIC codes. They gave half of the growth, over 3%, up to $3 million back to tourism promotion efforts. You're going to hear much more about Utah coming up. Utah did this way back in 2005, and the legislature allocates that funding to the Utah Office of Tourism Promotion. One of the things I really like about Utah is it's called the Utah Marketing Performance Fund, and it's all focused on performance. Their budget was at a low of about $7 million and now is in the $25 million range out of this fund. So let's now, without further ado, let's bring on our next panel here. And I was fortunate to introduce Laura Libby earlier. Let me give a brief introduction of Dave Williams. I mentioned he's Associate Managing Director of the Utah Office of Tourism. I'll tell you, he joined the Utah office in 2003 as research coordinator. And note that date, 2003, that was just after Utah had the Olympics. And he was one of the architects of their sales tax increment funding program. I was so excited that he agreed to come on with us today because he helped design it. He helped create it. Dave has a lot of talents, not only research, he has an MBA. He's held many different positions within the organization and really is one of the country's leading experts when it comes to this concept of sales tax increment financing. So with that, Laura, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it. Dave, we'll jump right in. And as John mentioned, as in part of the introduction, you were on the ground floor of the establishment of the Tourism Promotion or Performance Fund. Can you talk a little bit about how it got started, what the thinking was, and did you have industry support and legislative support right from the beginning, or what did you do to sort of build that out?
Thanks, Laura. When I got hired in 2003, our overall office budget was bigger than this, but the marketing portion of our budget was about $300,000. And the tourism industry in our state recognized that we needed more funding to compete. They weren't agreed on how we should be funded. In Utah, bed tax, restaurant tax, car rental tax, all of that tax revenue goes back to the counties. None of it goes to the state. And so it was proposed that we try to do a very slight increase to the lodging tax, a very slight increase to the restaurant tax, and provide that money to the state tourism office. And the counties were not on board with that idea. They felt that we were dipping into their revenue stream. And we'd appear in front of our legislative committee with a fractured industry that wasn't in agreement about how to fund the office. And so the legislature didn't pass or approve of that type of funding. The Tourism Industry Association in the state gathered together key stakeholders, including some key legislators, and said, we need to solve this problem. The legislators said they would not approve any type of a tax increase. So I was tasked to go back and look at what other states were doing and how they were funded. And we came upon the Missouri model that John just mentioned. And I spent a lot of time with Deanne McKinney in the Missouri Tourism Office asking how their funding system worked. And she provided us with a lot of information, and we basically started pitching that idea. The legislators liked it because it's all performance-based. As you grow sales tax revenue in tourism-related industries, the idea is that then the office gets more funding. That was something the industry could accept. We went all around the state selling it to not just legislators, but also informing county commissioners, in addition to other stakeholders in the industry, to try to get a unified effort. Also, a lot of effort was made by the Industry Association to get the upcoming new governor on board with the idea. He was very supportive of it. And it finally passed in 2005. And they started us off with a base amount of $10 million. So we went from a $300,000 ad budget to $10 million in a single year. A huge part of getting that support was that the legislation stated that 20% of the funding had to go towards a cooperative marketing program where we do a one-to-one match with county tourism offices, convention and visitor bureaus, and also with nonprofit organizations that put on events to bring in tourists. So that was a huge selling point.
Yeah, and I think we have a couple of examples of that, those funds put to use that we can look at a little bit too. But I just, in talking a little bit more, I know John mentioned the NAICS codes. There's been an evolution, obviously, since 2005 of the funds. A couple questions. How did you plan during the sort of growth period or earning period? How did the office plan for that, knowing that it could vary from year to year as you were in that growth phase or step backs as that occurred? And then what has it evolved to now, especially with sort of like we talked about before, the weighting of NAICS codes and some of those things? How has that sort of planning and evolution occurred?
Well, we initially set it up very similar to how Missouri did. We had 17 NAICS codes. It was the same way. We'd get half of the revenue above 3% up to $3 million a year as the increment. As the year goes along, we look at our indicators that everybody else looks at. We look at how is our bed tax revenue looking? How is restaurant tax revenue looking? What are our other visitation stats at our key destinations? And so we would have a good idea of how the year was looking as far as if we thought we would qualify or not. In 2014, we had come under some criticism that, well, you're taking half the revenue over, above 3%, but if you're looking at restaurants, that residents are playing a huge role in that. That's not just visitors. And so we worked closely with the University of Utah and the Governor's Office of Management and Budget to weight each of the NAICS codes. And we actually added some. So that's how we got up to 21 NAICS codes. And they're each weighted for what percent they think is based on visitor spending rather than resident. And so that was a way to eliminate that criticism.
Now, since 2005, I think initially you talked about how there had to be a lot of education around how the formula would work and how all of that would happen. Now that it's in a more mature state, do you, is the effort more around tourism promotion education, or are you still constantly sort of educating the industry and newly elected officials about the TMPF?
Well, I think we have to constantly educate new elected officials on the value of tourism and how tourism is a key driver of the state economy and local economies. We spend less time trying to explain the formula, which we had to do in the early days. We spend more time talking about the economic benefits, and also as tourism's evolved and people are concerned about quality of life, crowding at key destinations, we spend a lot of time talking about our Red Emerald strategy, which our Managing Director, Vicky Varela, introduced to the industry, I think back in 2017. And that's all about being a destination management organization and making sure that we're bringing in visitors that will really explore the state, go beyond just the most well-known locations, and spread out throughout the state so that everybody can benefit from the spending. So we spend a lot of time talking about that now.
Yeah. For anyone on the call thinking about this, what recommendations would you have for them to start thinking about this process, and lessons you learned or challenges that you encountered that they could potentially avoid?
I think one of the biggest things is to try to figure out how to explain it in a simple way. It can be a pretty complicated formula if you get into the weeds with it. Absolutely essential for us has been a unified industry. And then our managing director, also the Utah Tourism Industry Association, and key stakeholders have great relationships with legislative leadership and with the governor. And you've got to maintain that government support, that political support, because even though there's a formula in place, the legislature has the ultimate say in what happens with the funding, and they can disregard the formula if they want. We actually saw that happen during the Great Recession, where they believed in tourism enough to still give us significant money, but they didn't follow the formula. And see, that political support is key, and you can't let up. I think we've seen in Missouri where they had the support and then they didn't have the support, and their funding dropped off. So it's important.
Yeah, I think right now on the screen, we're looking at sort of the growth of that fund. If there's anything you would want to add to that growth, you can see some of the step back like you talked about in the Great Recession time.
Right. And I just say, we start off with $10 million. We qualified to continue to grow the fund, and the legislators just kind of kept us around that $11 million mark, even though we should have been up around 12 or 14. Then the recession hit. You can see the dip in 2010 through 2012. And then and a key part is that showing an ROI. I mean, we worked really hard to show a strong ROI for our efforts, and you can see how steadily the funding climbed with a lot of support and hard work from a ton of people in our industry. And then in 2021, the money appropriated to the fund dropped off, but we also were able to receive $12 million of CARES funding, which basically kept us whole at 24 million, which is where we were hoping to be. I think we were one of only a few states in the country that got that CARES funding for a state tourism office. So, the political support has absolutely been huge.
Yeah. To be sure, we've got some time for Q&A. I know that the process of how counties come for the money and how this works is a great ROI example. I think how you've sort of evolved that is something that would be a great sharing point, maybe as a follow-up here. So I think just as I kind of wrap up here, the COVID times, I think you've sort of seen, and you talked about building some of your formulas initially on the end of 9/11 and coming out of that, and then looking at the Great Recession. Are there any other lessons you've learned that people could apply to future sort of recovery times with this funding mechanism?
Well, I think having a unified industry is key. We can't just sell it ourselves. A key selling point has been that the local tourism partners have been going to their legislators saying, we need this funding. This co-op program means so much to our efforts, as does the overall marketing effort that the office does. And so making sure that your own industry understands what you're doing and feels like they have a say in how we're spending the money has been key. And then that message can be spread to legislators. And then you just have to measure so that you can show the benefit of what you're doing, and be ready to adjust when hard times hit, like right now, make the right adjustments so you're still showing a strong return.
Thank you, Dave. I appreciate it. Chris, I will hand it to you to ask some questions of our panelists here coming up. So thank you.
Very good. So I think we've just got a couple of minutes left before we wrap up. You see on your screen, we're looking at continuing this series, and the next topic, regenerative funding. It'll be part of our transatlantic webinar next week. We're probably looking at a date early in the new year. So that's ways in which Dmos can be more actively involved in funding streams to community, environmental, social projects and programs. And a reminder about that webinar, you see right there, November the 10th. It's actually 11 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock if you're in Europe, 8 o'clock on the West Coast there, John. And we've got a great panel. Just in the final couple of minutes, there is a question here about there's concern around tax mechanisms, or looking at these tax mechanisms, resistance because they believe their destination might be priced out of the market. It might hinder market share or their competitive advantage. So that's actually going to be dealt with in the transatlantic webinar. Our European partners there actually looked at the available evidence on that. It's negligible to very modest. Any sort of competitive impact is slight. Probably additional work needs to be done in this space, but perhaps I can open it up to John and the panel. Is that an issue that you dealt with? A concern that raising taxes or introducing taxes would make you less competitive?
I turn it over to our panel members, Kevin or Julie.
It's never been an issue with us, but we have a lower average daily rate, unfortunately, than a lot of our competitors. So when you put it all together, it's still pretty modest, right? But we've never lost a group because
Yeah.
I would agree I would agree for us as well. In Philadelphia as well as San Diego, it wasn't a challenge. The thing that I would say is just to make sure that, the moment that DMOs say and hotels agree that they're able to increase their tax, that elected officials don't try to do that on their own and use that for other funding. But I'm with Kevin, it was not an issue for us. And John knows this. In Philadelphia, when it was first approached, the Hotel Association immediately said, no, there's no way we can do this. And after, showing what we were able to do with the funding and the fact that they would be valuable partners at the table to approve those applications, that quickly turned from a no to a yes. So some of it is how you set it up and the backup information that you give as to why. And I think that also applies to the other question that's in the chat about, the existing funding versus additional. And I'm with Kevin, and Kevin said it right. If you're able to keep that additional funding, you should. To keep the existing funding, you should be asking for the additional funding and have a plan of how you're going to use it. You just, you can't just go and say we need our budget to increase and not show why. I mean, there has to either be marketing plans and or bid funds and or, just making yourself competitive, but you definitely have to have a plan in place.
And our clients tend to be very careful about what they do in this. They look at national averages, they look at their comp set. They're usually, like Julie said, a very minor increase, 1 or 2%. And even since COVID, I know one of the questions asked that, we've seen hotels, although many are really fighting for their lives and to stay open and to keep in business. There are many hotels that have said, these are the resources we're going to need to help us get through the recovery. And if we don't have something that has those resources dedicated, we will not effectively compete with other destinations. So there's been a lot of hotels that say, we've got to be thinking not just about today and tomorrow, but 6 months from now, a year from now, where are we going to be and will we have the resources to compete? And we've seen a lot of them say, let's keep moving. Let's put something like this on so that we can get those resources so that we can be effective at hopefully being very successful in the recovery phase.
And I'll tell you, John, as you know, San Diego is one of those. We will by the end of this 6 months fiscal year, we're spending $6 million in marketing to San Diego because of the TMD. And it's proving to be successful. Our hotels on the weekend right now, and I'm going to knock on wood, are running between 70 and 90% occupancy on that Friday, Saturday. We certainly still have a long way to go for Sunday through Wednesday, but I shudder to think what we would have been able to not do if we didn't have that dedicated resource that helped keep our hotels afloat, because they don't have any money to market right now. And we've been able to market San Diego on their behalf.
Okay, I'm conscious we've just ticked past the top of the hour. So perhaps, John, you want to thank everybody and wrap it up? Thanks very much for the opportunity.
I do. And there's so much more we could talk about. This has been such a great group. Like I said at the outset, we're very lucky to have Dave and Julie and Kevin join us today. They're all national leaders in their own right. They've done some really amazing things as it relates to funding in their destinations. And thank you, each of you, for joining us today. I want to say thank you to Chris and Laura and Miles Partnership. You guys have been tremendous, really doing a lot of the heavy lifting here and doing so much in the research space and giving back to the industry. And most of all, I want to thank all of you. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. I want to say happy election day. Hopefully everybody voted, but thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to be talking to you very soon.
John.